Hey, this is Cedric Youngelman, your host of the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. Before we get into this fantastic rip with Paul Tarantino, the Director of Business Development over at Byte Federal here in Venice, Florida, about his awesome presentation on fiscal dominance, the doom cycle the Federal Reserve now finds itself in, the deflationary pressures of AI, and how Bitcoin is the last currency standing. I want to give a quick shout out to our amazing Bitcoin-focused sponsors that I use myself and recommend to my friends and family. Today's episode is brought to you by River, the preferred choice for buying Bitcoin. Why do I recommend River? Because I personally use the service and they offer zero fees on recurring Bitcoin purchases. You can dollar cost average hourly, daily, weekly, or monthly. Every Bitcoin is stored in a one-to-one multi-sig cold storage, meaning your assets are always accessible. Plus, with US-based phone support, help is just a call away. They also have this cool feature called Riverlink, which allows you to send Bitcoin via text to anyone, which can be claimed to any wallet. River makes it simple and secure to save your wealth in Bitcoin. Get up to $100 when you sign up and buy Bitcoin on partner.river.com/matrix. With Thea, your Bitcoin stays in your control. Thea's module multi-sig gives you full control to create a setup that meets your specific needs. Cold storage with your favorite hardware wallets, mobile vaults for ease of use, or inviting a family member or financial advisor to hold your key in a collaborative manner. Support for your favorite Bitcoin hardware wallets like Trezor, Coldcard, Ledger, Foundation, and Jade. Add these devices as signing keys in your Thea multisig with ease. And Thea's comprehensive suite of security and recovery tools ensures you'll always have access to your Bitcoin, even if you lose a key or Thea is no longer available. Full control over your Bitcoin. Experience true Bitcoin ownership with Thea. Download Thea at thea.us/Cedric. That's THEYA.US/CEDRIC. And get your first 6 months free and secure your multi-generational Bitcoin legacy today. Bitcoin Day on Saturday, May 11th in Miami, Florida, is designed to forge lifelong connections between exciting speakers and all good people anywhere on their Bitcoin journey. Bitcoin Day brings you your favorite Bitcoiners that are only seen from a distance at the big shows, and instead brings everyone together in the same room for a strategic day of vision and action. It also has quickly become my favorite Bitcoin conference, and that's why I'll be in Miami this Saturday, May 11th. Tickets are selling out fast, so head over to bitcoinday.io Miami 24 now and use the code MATRIX for a discount on your ticket. I hope to see you there. We'll talk Bitcoin all day and then grab an ice-cold beer and a steak at the after party. This podcast, from recording to editing to marketing, is 100% self-ran by yours truly. All boosts on the Fountain app go directly toward making future episodes as awesome as possible for you all. And now, let's enter the Bitcoin Matrix for this thought-provoking conversation with my man, Paul Tarantino.
What is real? How do you define real?
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash. What do? You get out.
Paul Tarantino is the Director of Business Development at Byte Federal, the 7th largest Bitcoin ATM operator and manufacturer on the planet. He is a founding member of the Florida Blockchain Business Association, Bitcoin speaker and educator and investor. Paul also assists Bitcoin companies looking to set up international operations in South and Central America in association with Carlos Miguel Rivas of El Salvador. His passions include his family, hard money, real food, tough love, and fly fishing. Paul Tarantino, welcome to the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Cedric.
Yeah, man. It's exciting to chat. We've been, we're both down here in Sarasota.
Yeah.
So, we got to know each other, I think, at one of maybe the meetups at the Bitcoin Key Club in downtown.
Right. That's right. Well, you know what? If I remember correctly, I think I bumped into you a long time ago at, I think, Bitcoin Miami.
Maybe Bitcoin Day
2020
Naples.
or 2021. Said hi
Okay.
to you because I knew you probably didn't have, you had no idea who I was. I was just like, there's Cedric. I love his show. Said hi to you, and then we bumped back into each other. I think at BQuest there at the Bitcoin Key Club.
Yeah, and that's been actually fun to over the last year or two see that grow.
Mm-hmm. They're
And it's
doing a
off
great
to an
job.
amazing start. It's a nice community here in Southwest Florida, and all the way from Orlando. Now I've met people to Tampa, St. Pete, down to Naples. Great
Yeah.
clubs. We'll both be in Miami on May 11th for Bitcoin Day Miami, which has become a fun little conference. One of my favorites. I think you were at Bitcoin Day Naples
Yep.
maybe this February-ish, and
Correct.
maybe even the year before that.
I was not a speaker, but I was attendee. Yep.
Yeah. So those have been great. I'm sure you're looking forward to the one in Miami. That's gonna be a fun
I am.
day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
And how have
Florida has become quite the hotbed for Bitcoin activity. And it's so awesome to be able to do sort of 2 hours in any direction and talk to a whole new group of people and constantly see new people coming to the meetups and learning. I mean, literally every time I attend, there's new people I've never met before that have interesting stories that have moved here from wherever in the world and brought their Bitcoin story with them. So it's been really cool to see
yeah.
Florida grow up into the Bitcoin hub.
Well, to me, it seems like the best state to be a Bitcoiner. Maybe
I
that's
agree.
a little arrogant and obnoxious, but
No,
sorry,
no,
not sorry,
it's
but
100%. Sorry, Texas, but I think we took it.
but you've been here quite a while. You've probably seen it, grow quite a bit or change.
Yeah. So we have Stephen Lupka of
Yeah.
Swan. We we met each other. He was he was wearing a Ask Me About Bitcoin t-shirt, and I was having lunch downtown, and it was like the first person I ever saw with a Bitcoin shirt on, in Sarasota. And I yelled at him, and the next hour, I think we talked about Bitcoin and planned the our first Bitcoin meetup. And so yeah, so anyways, um we've been talking to people, and people have been in the Bitcoin community here for a long time. We have Charlie Shrem here, all the boys at Byte Federal, Samuel Arms, who's doing unbelievable work with the Florida Blockchain Business Association, which I still kick you, Samuel, for not calling it the Florida Bitcoin Association. But no, he's awesome. He's done a lot of great work. And yeah, I mean, everything that's happening in Miami is changing the landscape for Florida from a financial and a Bitcoin perspective. The Gulf Coast, we could pay taxes in Bitcoin in certain parts of the state, an anti-CBDC law. I mean, I agree with you 100%. I feel like if I'm going to be a Bitcoiner anywhere in the United States, it's about as good as it gets.
Yeah, it's got a great mix. You mentioned downtown. I think Sarasota, just enough city,
Yeah,
but it's great. I love it. Very charming. And speaking sort of the Bitcoin Key Club meetup here, I got to see your presentation recently, and it caught my eye, and I really enjoyed it. So I thought it'd be
great.
great to talk about it on the show.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to get into it. I think it's called The Last Currency Standing.
Yes.
And I think it's very topical. I mean, everything going on maybe in the news today or some of the current debate. But this has a much more maybe grounded view and more zoomed out. So
Sure. Yeah.
maybe we could just start with what some of the basics of a debt-based monetary system.
Sure.
Like in terms
I
of inflation and deflation.
sure. And what I guess what I, to start, let me kind of give you and the audience a little background information, right? So I spent 25 years in finance, and before I went to work full time at Byte Federal. And that entire time was spent taking these complex monetary, economic, investment ideas and acronyms and trying to boil them down in a very simple fashion so that my client sitting across the table from me could grasp it, understand the importance of it, and then from there, give me the permission or give me the trust and the faith to take action in their portfolios the way I wanted to. So this presentation that I gave, I think the first time I gave it was maybe October or November of last year, was really about taking everything I had learned from the thinkers in Bitcoin. And I built this presentation as a way to communicate that information to clients whose portfolio I was managing, right? So how do you take the big thoughts that you hear from Jeff Booth and all of the receipts that Lynn Alden and Luke Groman are producing that back up that these sort of bigger visions of the world, and boil it down into a presentation that say an 80-year-old, a 70-year-old, a 6-year-old could grok that doesn't have any financial background, and di help them understand why I wanted to take certain actions in their portfolio. So from there, then it became obvious to me, that Bitcoin is the most brilliant financial educational tool on the planet. It's far better than any financial education I ever received in college, any licensing I ever achieved throughout my career, any credentials. The Bitcoin education system that comes with, or the financial education system that comes with trying to understand Bitcoin has taught me more than I've learned in my entire life. And so, in helping me understand that, it was just a way for me to simplify it, boil it down, and hopefully impart that knowledge on others. So I use a lot of this stuff in my everyday orange pilling now, and it's helped me, and I think it's helped a lot of people understand things rather quickly. So with that being said, when I start talking about the debt-based monetary system, it's really from the perspective that most people don't even understand where money comes from. They don't understand how money is connected to debt and the impacts of that, right? So when we sit here and we talk about debt-based monetary system, I try and make sure that they start to realize that the debt requires inflation for it to be solvent. That without inflation, the debt becomes more and more expensive due to what Jeff Booth describes as the cost of production always decreasing, or the deflation of prices over time, right? So when you think of a free market competing, an economic competition, there's a natural incentive to drive all prices of goods lower and lower and lower. And that deflation means that businesses and individuals are making less and less money. Therefore, debt becomes harder and harder to service. That not only applies to us individually, but also applies to the government. So if you think of deflation, or the reduction of prices, the reduction in earnings, the reduction in profitability, making it harder and harder and harder to pay for your debts, you start to understand why inflation is necessary in order to remain solvent. So we obviously understand that from our own sort of checkbook balancing and our own day-to-day life, but this applies to the government as well at a different scale. So, people can kind of take that, frame it, understand it, and then from there we start to talk about money in terms of just the price of things. So I always like to start with, you take all the things you want, right? All the goods and services that are available in the world on one side of a weights and measure scale. So here's everything you want. And all of that stuff is priced in dollars. And all the goods and services in the world have a price, and that's the balance of the scale. I said, inflation is increasing the supply of money. So as you put more money on this side of the scale, the price of goods and services go up. And I like to use COVID as sort of the litmus test, or the best, most recent memory for them to understand how this works. And I explain it through the lens of, remember back during COVID when you were locked down, your businesses were shut down, you're sitting in your house, you're doing no economic activity, and the price of everything is going up. The only way the price of the activity went up is because 30% more money came onto this side of the scale and rose the price of goods. And so I explained to them that that's inflation. That's the basic understanding of monetary inflation. Now that's a massive oversimplification, right? This thing is constantly moving. But I want to trim all that away so that people can just begin to understand the simplicity of that relationship. And so that's where we start, and then maybe I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. Well, then I guess the next question would be, what are the three key drivers of hyper Bitcoinization?
Okay. Well, that's why I called the presentation the last currency standing. Because in my mind, yes, we are obviously winning from adoption. But I think in the end run, Bitcoin wins because it's the last currency standing. That all other currencies fail in its wake. And people end up being forced to use Bitcoin. So either you're adopting it early, you're learning it early, you're getting ahead of the curve, and unfortunately, if you're not, I think you're going to be forced into using a system that is the last currency standing. And then, so in the presentation, I go through three different mechanisms by which that takes place. One is this battle between deflation, meaning all technology reducing the cost or reducing the price of goods and services. And this is accelerating because if you look today, just say at Bitcoin and the Nasdaq as representatives of deflation, a deflating currency, a shrinking supply, a reducing supply of new currency units coming into the system, and the Nasdaq is a representation of technology that's digitizing the world, providing more goods and services at a lower price. Those deflationary forces combined with the population demographics, combined with other metrics in society, have continually dropped the price of goods, continually put pressure on deflation as debt is expanding. So from our earlier explanation, hopefully that makes sense, and that the debt is now becoming harder and harder to pay because your income is, or your profitability is shrinking. As that debt becomes harder and harder to pay, the government requires more inflation to offset it. What that means is the government has a mechanism by which to increase their income that we don't. Meaning, the only way you and I are going to increase our income, inflate our income, is go get a second job, ask for a raise, get higher pay. The government can create new monetary units, which, as we described, sets a higher price on goods and services. If you set a higher price on goods and services, you're going to get higher GDP. And GDP is government income. It's the income base that they get to tax that then is a revenue that they get to spend. So an increasing GDP makes it easier for the government to pay their debt, just like an increasing income makes it easier for us to pay our debt. But they have this little tool through inflation that allows them to artificially increase their income. At the same time, when they artificially increase GDP through inflation, what they've done, in essence, is decreased the purchasing power of the dollar. Right? That's the other way of thinking about it. A lot of people think of inflation, prices have gone up, those evil companies they're ripping us off. Right? It's not the right way to think about it. Really, what's happening is these prices have gone up because more currency units have gone onto that side of the scale. That means, in essence, your dollar is purchasing a lot less. Right? So if your dollar is purchasing a lot less, you and I have less purchasing power. The government gets higher GDP because goods and services have gone up. They got higher capital gains tax. They've got a larger tax base. They have more revenue. It's a win for the government. It's theft for you and I. Okay, but at the end of the day, what have we talked about? We've talked about the dollar losing purchasing power. The dollar's losing purchasing power. Fiat around the world that's being inflated is losing purchasing power. Bitcoin's gaining purchasing power, this currency is dying relative to Bitcoin, right? So that's one pressure on every currency outside the Bitcoin network that's going to end with Bitcoin being the last currency standing. So that's number one. Number two is the shift away from using the dollar and therefore the treasuries, because we talked about earlier that all money comes into existence from debt. So if you're going to the US government, the treasury, selling treasuries, the buyers of that treasury debt, right, has traditionally been these big banks. As these big banks are no longer interested, and these foreign buyers are no longer interested, and us as individuals are no longer interested in consuming all the debt of the government, something has to come in to buy that debt so that money can come into existence. What that has been is the Federal Reserve. This is what we call financing the deficits. The Federal Reserve will come in, add new monetary units to the system, and take that debt. And this is the inflation of the currency. So what ends up happening as they are buying this debt, or as we are refusing to buy the debt, the Fed is left as the buyer of last resort, the interest rate on those treasuries is starting to rise, right? So I'm not going to buy your debt unless interest rates go up. If I'm not going to buy your debt unless interest rates go up, that is making the existing debt, right, new debt more expensive. It's adding to the deficit. It's adding to the debt pile. It's adding to the burden of the government to pay that debt. And it's making it harder and harder to finance that debt, to pay that interest. But because they don't have to worry about going bankrupt, they can continue that cycle. They can continue that loop in perpetuity by just adding new units to the system, ever growing the deficits. And that eventually, as we have seen recently, puts us into what's called fiscal dominance. This fiscal dominance is starting to create what you'll hear lots of folks talk about is the debt spiral, right? The debt spiral is a situation we get into where all of a sudden the interest on the debt is so expensive, it becomes the burden that we can no longer pay for out of tax revenue. And so we have to create more monetary units, new monetary units into the system to pay the interest on that debt. That starts to snowball. And this is where you get a debt spiral. Well, the debt just continues to rise over time as we issue new debt to bring in more monetary units to fund the operations of the government. And as that persists, we get into a position where the treasury debt, which is the base reserve of the global reserve currency, the dollar, is less and less and less desirable. It's losing purchasing power. As interest rates go up, it's dropping in value. So now foreign holders of our debt, us as private individuals, and even the banks are less interested in taking more treasuries because it's not going to keep up. They're going to lose purchasing power relative to the rate of inflation. They're starting to lose value faster as more and more currency units come into the system. So that debt spiral is another way that you kill fiat currency, another way you kill the dollar. And it's not just me saying this, right? I think I provided you with some really some great quotes for some high level investors that see this. The St. Louis Federal Reserve published a paper in February 2023 that outlines this. They know exactly what's going on. They're not saying it out loud, but they certainly are aware of what's happening. And they're outlining, right? In St. Louis Fed speak, they're describing what Bitcoiners have been saying for many, many years. And so when you look at those facts, You start to frame up this thing. Well, okay, the currency's dying, but they don't want us to know. And why do they not want us to know? What are they trying to hide? Is inflation the true rate of inflation? Is the issuance of treasury debt bigger than we think it is? Are things happening in the world actually to accelerate inflation rather than to fight it? Even though we're talking about fighting it, are there things in the world being done that's actually accelerating it? So, it can lead you into all these rational explanations as to why you should maybe question what you're hearing, and once you look at the data. And then the third one, which I find fascinating, is artificial intelligence. And earlier we talked about how technology, represented by the NASDAQ and Bitcoin, have had deflationary forces on the real economy. And now we're adding artificial intelligence to the mix. Prior to artificial intelligence, a lot of the deflation was showing up in hardware and software from the perspective of you no longer buy an atlas, right? You just download maps and you use MapQuest and Google Maps and whatever. You no longer buy records and CDs. You just subscribe to Spotify. I no longer pay a cable bill, right? I pay $7 a month or $9 a month to Netflix or whatever, right? So technology is driving a huge amount of deflation. Where deflation has not shown up is in the more say white collar services and businesses, where technology has not been able to efficiently and effectively replace that brain power. And artificial intelligence is sitting there picking apart at it as we speak. So if you've ever been to like Trueflation or the other websites that really show inflation as a vector of all the different services throughout products and services throughout the world, or the economy, and you begin to see all the ones that are going down that have been impacted by current technology versus all the stuff where we've seen inflation in real estate and healthcare and financial services, etc. And now here comes artificial intelligence that's going after those markets at a rapid rate and could drive the price of those goods and services down exponentially. So I feel like the rate of deflation that's ahead of us is exponential. Jeff Booth talks a lot about this. And this exponential rate of deflation that's coming in through artificial intelligence is going to require enormous amounts of inflation in order to keep the US government, and for that matter, all governments, solvent. And so it's this, I was going to sum it all up, right? It's this big battle occurring between real economic deflation and artificial financial inflation so that we can pay for the debt. And once you understand that, you begin to paint yourself a picture that as the economy advances, as technology advances, as demographics change, it's inevitable that the governments have to print enormous amounts of money to keep the debt solvent, or we're going to default. If you print money and you keep fighting deflation with inflation, you can kick the can down the road. We can keep this going for some time, and Bitcoin will be there to absorb the new monetary units and put continued pressure on every government that prints money. Imagine it's like the biggest catcher's mitt, the best catcher in pro baseball. You can throw anything at him, it's not getting by. That's Bitcoin. And every pitch is a new monetary unit. and it's just going to start absorbing. The faster you throw, the harder you throw, the more wild you throw. There's nothing getting past Bitcoin. It's the monetary sponge. And so for the first time in human history, I think there is a offsetting protocol that's going to make it incredibly difficult for sovereign entities, sovereign states, to inflate their way out of the debt. And that is something they've never experienced. So I suspect the first option is going to be print harder, baby, print more, baby, and Bitcoin will just grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it dominates, and it's the only currency worth using.
So I think I got a little twist at the end. I followed everything except for maybe I think deflation leads to the insolvency of governments, I think is what you said.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
hopefully I said that out loud.
in that framework, from a government perspective, anything deflationary is bad.
Right.
Whereas I kind of took it as they thought deflationary was good because it would mask some of the inflation.
Well,
but you're
right. So it's good up until the point that it makes paying the debt, right? So this is like the 2% target, right? If you can target a 2% inflation, you can kind of kick this can down the road for a while, right? Which is why we're targeting that. But when we introduced 30% more monetary units to the system and during COVID, that was like the shot across the bow, right? That was like war's on. Can we recover from that? I mean, if the inflationary spike that ensued, right? How would you stop that? Traditionally, you would raise interest rates. By raising interest rates, you're going to withdraw money from the system. You're going to pull it out of the real economy and you're going to pull it into the banking system. You're going to slow down lending, and that's all going to be pulling monetary units out of the system in an effort to try and slow down inflation. But when you slide into fiscal dominance, the raising of the interest rates is creating more debt. And you're starting to get this debt spiral, right? So because you've crossed the precipice, because you've exceeded your debt levels relative to the GDP that you can tax has been exceeded. Now raising the interest rate makes the debt burden harder to pay as more and more new debt is issued at this higher interest rate. And so this is what causes the debt spiral. This is why all of a sudden, what has worked for 40 plus years, meaning we'll just keep creeping interest rates down in the face of every economic crisis, all of a sudden that stops having less and less impact till COVID, it no longer works, right? This is like we hit zero. Okay, it's not working. Let's add 30% more money to the system. We kick off inflation. We now have a debt to GDP ratio 120%. It goes above that during COVID. Now, okay, we got to try and rein this in. Raise interest rates. It starts to pull it back. Then wars start. Inflation creeps back up. Then another war starts. Inflation starts to creep back up. It's becoming more and more evident that it's becoming very, very difficult to get back to 2%. So if we're going to be stuck at a higher interest rate longer, now we hear talk about, well, they're going to lower interest rates because inflation is going to come down to 3%, and it hasn't. Right? So we keep getting this position where the debt just keeps stacking. We're sending more money to Israel. We're sending more money to Ukraine, adding to the deficit, adding to the debt burden at a higher and higher interest rate. And all of that is leading to an unsustainable debt load that is growing off its own interest rate, right? It's like, okay, I can't pay my credit card this month. My credit card bill's $10,000 and I can only pay 1,000 on it this month. And you keep persisting like that for some time, and then your interest rate goes from 20% to 24% to 30%. I'm not saying that's I'm just saying as an individual, right? And then all of a sudden you're in a position where, I mean, all I can do is maybe get a new credit card at a lower interest rate to try and pay down this other credit card, and then you're missing both payments, right? So this is how individuals go bankrupt. Governments don't go bankrupt. They create inflation. And unfortunately, that's a theft from the everyday person, and they don't realize how the kind of impact, right? So if people don't figure this out, I'm afraid that we're going to have a very chaotic episode in the United States. And that we're going to end up being where Bitcoin is the last currency standing. Great for me, great for you, horrible for humanity. So we would, but I'm afraid we might have gone over the edge. I don't know that we're in a position now where that's going to be recoverable. And that's really what this presentation about is: prepare for the worst. Get yourself in a position, get your portfolio in a position where you're going to benefit from inflation. Because I think it's coming. I think it's coming, whether it's coming in one or two fashions. It's either coming super fast at a very high rate of inflation, or it's going to drag out for a decade or longer until the government gets the debt to GDP ratio back in alignment.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree and see where this is going alongside you. To read a little bit from your work, just kind of looking at the three layers of massive debt that we're facing, and this is written, this is probably slightly dated, but 1.7 trillion
Yeah.
for the fiscal 2023 budget deficit, 33.6 trillion in current national debt, probably like
Right.
34 trillion or something more than now. And in unfunded obligations, which is 75 trillion, 22 and a half of that is Social Security, and 53 trillion is Medicare.
Yeah.
I mean, that those numbers aren't even really tossed around that often. So I don't think a lot of people kind of even recognize that as sort of part of our debt load here.
Right.
And you can see this national debt, the growth, just in terms of the political parties. It's just exponential growth since 1996 on the national debt, no matter who's in charge or which regime.
Right.
And you even see with just Federal Reserve chairs just over the last 50 years, each party renominates the prior party's appointee, just in terms of, so I don't think it's really a red or blue thing here. And then in terms of the debt spiral, private debt isn't deflationary, that and public debt is inflationary. So the U.S. is in a fiscal dominant regime versus a monetary dominant regime. Fiscal dominance, government income no longer covers expenses. The Fed is no longer capable of manipulating the system via interest rates. The high levels of public debt prevent the Fed from being able to fight inflation. And 98% of fiat currencies have failed once they exceed debt to GDP of 120%. And just, in my own career, I see, huge efforts by companies to kind of find deflation wherever they can, just in terms of costs. So
Right.
I think a big one, we're going to talk about AI probably a little bit, but like in corporate America, a lot of it's machine learning, just trying to figure out, things that white collar employees are doing that are rote and routinized, and that you could kind of just make a standard operating procedure or a memo and figure out how to do their, data entry or whatever they sling around in Excel, have a robot do it basically, or a prompt.
Right.
And just memorize what they do, or just program it to do those things over and over. And looking at the doom loop, you describe it, the fiscal dominance, the debt to high relative to GDP. So there's not enough income to pay for the debt. So, to pay debt, government borrows more from Fed, thereby expanding M2. M2 goes up, inflation goes up, loss in purchasing power of the dollar. The Fed mandate maintain price stability. So they're going to fight inflation, triggers raising Fed fund rate. Fed funds rate up equals interest expense on U.S. Treasury debt up equals debt up. Treasury interest expense up equals worse debt to GDP percentage equals not enough income to pay the debt. Brings you to not enough income to pay the debt equals need to borrow more money from the Fed. Brings you to pay the debt. Government borrows more from Fed, thereby expanding M2 right back at the beginning. And you're in the doom loop. And some of these quotes I think are important. So
Yeah.
former New
I
York
mean,
Federal
thank
Reserve.
you. I mean, I should just let you read the presentation because you're doing a far better job.
No, I mean so don't but let's get into some of these quotes here. So former New York Federal Reserve President Bill Dudley warns that the fiscal position of the United States is on an unsustainable trajectory. The situation is going to worsen because the government's debt will face significantly higher interest rates than what we've experienced over the past 15 years. Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, expressed concerns about the mounting U.S. government debt. We are nearing that turning point as we continue to spend at the current level. The need for more debt grows exponentially, creating a supply-demand problem exacerbated by internal political and social conflicts. Ken Griffin, the hedge fund titan, the figures are unsustainable and mark a major return to ballooning deficits after back-to-back declines during President Biden's first 2 years in office. Surging inflation, meanwhile, will increase the cost of funding the U.S. deficit. And this brings us to that report.
Yeah.
And I wasn't as familiar with sort of this fiscal dominance versus government dominance. And I guess because we haven't probably seen it in the last 40 or 50 years, at least in the States.
Yeah.
And this report gets, sorry.
I mean, no, it's an important point because for 40 years we've had little spats of inflation, but inflation, when you can manipulate the money supply with interest rates, or I should say deficits, when you can, we've had deficits in the past, right? We've had large deficits in the past, and they don't become an issue until you cross this fiscal dominance line, until the interest on the reserves is unsustainable, or the interest on the debt is unsustainable. Sorry. So this is what we're calling fiscal dominance, and this is what's causing the big problem. This is what's causing the doom loop. Um, you know, and this paper that I pointed out to you that was published by the St. Louis Fed in February 2023 says exactly what we're talking about. Maybe I'll just read a quote from it.
Yeah.
The article considers fiscal dominance, which is the possibility that accumulating government debt and deficits can produce increases in inflation that dominate central bank intentions to keep inflation low. It's a serious possibility for the United States in the near future. That's how it starts, right? So, and we can go through and talk more, about some of the points in this document, but it's like they handed the keys to Greg Foss and said, it's the math, dummy, and the math doesn't work. And here it is, and they're saying that amongst themselves. So I found this article incredibly interesting, and adds a lot of support to the argument that Bitcoiners have been making for some time.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this article was sobering.
Yeah.
I would put it under maybe MMT or modern monetary theory, but it wasn't as rosy or cheeky.
Well, that's funny that you said that, because when I read it, it made me think that the Federal Reserve must think the monetary, the MMT people must be out of their minds, because here they're describing all the repercussions of monetary modern theory.
Well, it's sobering.
Modern monetary theory.
I feel like they set out to. This does not support modern monetary theory.
Right.
This is a clear warning shot across the bow, and I felt this to be incredibly introspective.
Yeah.
By the Federal Reserve, to kind of write a paper like this. But
are the modern monetary theorists,
but it is trying to figure out how far we can go in line with modern monetary theory. Like, where is the line? Where's the ceiling? When is the public going to call the bluff?
Too much. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I want to get into this paper a little bit.
Sure.
I mean, under current policy and based on this report's assumptions, Government debt relative to GDP is projected to reach 566% by 2097.
Yeah.
The projected continuous rise of the debt to GDP ratio indicates that current policy is unsustainable. Financial report of the United States government, February 16, 2023. I mean, I think that's astounding. I think it's weird in a couple ways. One, that they use 2097.
Yeah.
It's kind of like,
That's
the 40,
ridiculous.
50
Yeah.
year mortgage. It's like if we throw this out far enough, it's not too scary, but it lets everyone know we're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Right. Because I mean, if they used like 2034 or 2047, because everyone would dial it back. It's kind of like everyone's going to give it a haircut anyway. But it clearly says this policy is unsustainable, and that's a report of the United States government. I mean, it can't get more sort of on category, just like
Yeah.
absolute
I took it
terms.
as kind of like a ridiculous linear projection that, of course, becomes a really big number when you're going out that far into the future. Um, but the reality of us ever getting there is so far-fetched, it's unbelievable.
Right.
Because later in the article they talk about um, the interest rate in the near future, which is pretty astounding, even at 2% target because of inflation, right?
Yeah.
Did you? So if I'll jump to the conclusion here, which is really interesting. It's quite possible that a fiscal dominance episode in the US would result in not only the end of the policy of paying interest on reserves, but also a return to requiring banks to hold a large fraction of their deposit liabilities as zero interest reserves. So it's quite likely we will not be paying the banks any interest for buying our debt. For example, under one illustrative example, I will show you that requiring banks to hold 40% of their deposits as zero interest reserves under reasonable assumptions would reduce the annual inflation rate to fund the deficits from inflation of 16% to only about 8%.
And I think there was like a top line of 41% if there was like the other end of that scenario.
Yes, yeah.
So these are big numbers. They're not shying away from it. They're
No.
asking real questions in this. When exactly will the U.S. hit the constraint of infeasibility, and how exactly will U.S. policy adjust to it? So you're getting into like where they draw their policy conclusions. Basically, is that we're not going to reduce spending. This report notes like Congress can't seem to figure out how to reduce spending or get along on that. And they note that. Um,
And the important thing I think to point out to the average reader of this too is that they talk a lot about the government funding its deficits with non-interest bearing debt.
right,
That's just straight money printing. That
right,
that translates to money printing.
right.
So um like if you a lot of times if you've never read anything like this and you just read that language,
Mm.
you might just think like, oh, yeah, so non-interest bearing debt. I don't really know
Right.
exactly
But they
what
can
that
only
means.
do that based on how much reserves are at the bank, right?
Right.
And so they talk about in this report, they're like, how much financial disintermediation? I mean, they're studying other countries, they're studying what happened in the 60s and 70s. Such financial disintermediation from banks occurred in the US in the 1960s and 70s as a result of high inflation and regulations, including both zero interest reserve requirements and ceilings on deposit interest rates. And they're noting how now, there would be, the need to preserve a high inflation tax base could lead to a political choice to preserve a technologically backward banking system. And this would be a continuation and acceleration of recent political trends to limit fintech bank chartering, as discussed by the same author 3 years ago. So, but they're also saying basically like banks would fight it because they
Yeah.
know money would flee banks
Yeah.
because it'd be basically like capital controls. Um,
Absolutely. Right. Like we saw a little glimpse of that late last year, right? Where the interest on your checking and savings account was incredibly low relative to what you could get in the money market. And all the money that was leaving the banking system to go into the money market system, making it harder and harder for banks to meet their reserves. So it's we're seeing signs of this. You can see early impacts of this, and uh, I think the other point you brought up about how we had a similar situation in the 70s, I think Lynn Alden does an awesome job about explaining why it's not at all like the 70s. Because I think our debt to GDP at that time was something like 30%, not 120%. So you could raise interest rates and hammer down inflation without throwing the US government's not putting the U.S. government into a debt spiral, not putting them in a position where new debt issued at that high interest rate was going to make it infeasible to pay the interest without creating new monetary units. So, I mean, they when you start reading, every time I read this, I pick up more and more data out of it that I'm like, oh my gosh, that translates to exactly what Bitcoiners have been talking about for the last 3 years. And it's just quite shocking that it's out there. It's been in the public for a long time, and so few people are talking about
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to read a little bit more from it. I like the
it.
questions in it. When exactly does fiscal dominance lead to monetization? How much does that threaten monetary policy's inflation goals? How much dollar inflation might result from excessive U.S. government borrowing? Where is the ceiling? Is an interest-bearing debt to GDP ratio of greater than 100% combined with current and projected deficits of that magnitude an immediate danger for inflation? The answer is sensitive to your beliefs about future government spending and taxes, about the government's ability to change spending and taxes to avoid issuing new debt if that becomes a problem, and about the path of future real interest rates and economic growth. The current debt to GDP ratio is on the range associated historically with the fiscal dominance ceiling. On the other hand, real interest rates are at historical lows, which means that higher debt to GDP ratios are feasible. It is hard to say precisely where the fiscal dominance ceiling is because that requires one to forecast economic growth, taxes, government expenditures, and real interest rates. As a country gets closer to the ceiling, the interest rates creditors demand rise as they demand an inflation risk premium in anticipation of the risk of hitting the ceiling. That means the perceived risk of hitting the ceiling once you are close to it can become self-fulfilling. Self-fulfilling. Rather than focus on the ceiling itself, it's better to ask what is the highest ratio of debt to GDP that is safely distant from the ceiling so that the government does not stumble into a self-fulfilling fiscal dominance equilibrium. I don't know the answer of where danger will arise, but there is a clear risk now that a rise in global real interest rates could reverse their 3 decades of decline, which remains poorly understood, which would make even the current debt to GDP ratio very risky, especially given that large primary deficits are projected to continue and that spending cuts are hard because so much of government spending in the US is from entitlements, not subject to annual appropriations or from military spending, which is unlikely to be reduced given the current geopolitical landscape. Taxes could be increased, but it seems unlikely to think that a divided Congress today would be nimble enough to do that, to stop an incipient inflation risk problem from emerging. What does a government that goes above the ceiling or even gets too close to the ceiling do to survive? It prints money. I mean, this is like right in the report.
I know.
And they put prints money in quotes. I mean, this is
Yeah,
awesome.
it is awesome. It is I mean, hopefully put this link in the show notes because it is an awesome piece of work coming out of the St. Louis Fed that I mean, I guess they're Bitcoiners now. Is what I get from reading it. The other thing I take away from reading it is that um like I said, we're sitting in this precipice, or we've just crossed this chasm, and I keep seeing things on the horizon that tell me that either powers that be are stoking the flames of inflation, impacting us in different ways to maintain inflation and make it stickier, make it harder to fight. And I can't help but see a future where it takes they're sort of behind the curve and they realize massive inflation is the only way out for government solvency, and making the decision, are we ripping the band-aid off hard and fast, or are we going to drag this thing out? because the longer they drag it out, the longer Bitcoiners are talking about this, the more articles like this persist, the more people learn, the angrier they're going to become.
I also think
So I think it puts us in a position where we're at risk of a change in policy for rapid inflationary pulses that people aren't prepared for. And when you start thinking like that, right, you get this FOMO, like I need more Bitcoin, I need more Bitcoin, I need more Bitcoin. And how do I get it as fast as possible? And it seems like the world's waking up to that.
yeah, for sure. I'm going to read the conclusion of this report.
Sure.
As a result of the high current U.S. government debt to GDP ratio and continuing projected deficits, we face a possible dollar inflation uncertainty nightmare. Continuing deficits, if unchecked, eventually will lead to a fiscal dominance problem. This problem seems likely given the way Congress has behaved in recent years. A significant rise in long-run real interest rates also seems quite possible, given that the 3 decades of decline in real interest rates are poorly understood and may reflect temporary demographic influences. Such an environment would hasten the triggering of a fiscal dominance problem, leading to a messy monetization in the US with ramifications worldwide. Many things would likely change in a fiscal dominance scenario to make the inflation tax base larger to facilitate the funding of continuing deficits with less of a rise in inflation. Interest on reserves would likely be eliminated. Otherwise, monetization would do little to relax the constraint on the government. Inflation would rise, potentially by a large amount, if that is the only policy used to create inflation taxation. If the elimination of interest on reserves were accompanied by a new large reserve requirement, inflationary consequences could be much lower. If the bond market does not anticipate a fiscal dominance shock sufficiently far in advance, where the definition of sufficiently far is determined by the duration of bonds held by the public, then bond investors would be caught with losses on high duration bonds. All of these changes imply that the effects on banks and mutual funds and pension funds and others would be potentially quite dramatic. Talks a little bit about financial disintermediation, but the end is, what bearing does the most recent debt ceiling agreement have on the prospects for fiscal reform to avert monetization and inflation? The agreement was largely beside the point because it focused on government expenditures that are not related to Medicare, Social Security, or defense spending. Indeed, by doing so, it reinforced the view that there is no appetite for addressing the exploding deficits that are being driven by those categories of spending. But this report, I don't think any of our politicians are reading this report.
Probably not.
No, I wouldn't think any of the national politicians, I don't even know if they would understand this.
Well, it's pretty, I don't know. It's pretty,
Uh,
I don't know. It's pretty straightforward.
so
I
who
mean,
is the
they don't, I
audience?
mean, there's a big wonky section in the middle where they get into the math, but
Yeah, that was
this,
really wonky.
this
Um,
summary, this summary, in abstract is pretty straightforward. Um, Certainly other countries are reading this as well and understand where the United States is at, which is evidenced by how little treasuries they've been consuming, how few treasuries they've been adding to their reserves, and the shift to gold, right? So it's when you look at the data and how much treasuries have drawn down overseas relative to how fast gold reserves are building up, it's obvious that they've recognized the potential, at least for this problem, for some time, and that it's become quite obvious since 2020. So I think this is why you see such a huge push towards the BRICS nations starting to settle trade in gold. I hear a lot of people talk about the BRICS currency being a gold-backed currency, which isn't the case. It is gold settled, which means that any excess, right, as you're doing trade, your currency for goods from another country, any currency that goes to that country that was sold you the goods that they don't want to hold or that they can't immediately spend back for goods in another from you is going to be converted into gold and held in gold. And why would they convert it into gold? They would convert it into gold to prevent the risk of inflation, the risk of those dollar or yuan or yen or whatever currency, rubles, losing purchasing power, right? So if the United States has this problem, right, and we're the cleanest shirt on the dirty shirt line, then uh, you know, and you look at how big our problem is, why would you hold anybody's currency? You would want to immediately convert it to something that's going to retain its purchasing power. And so we've just seen an immediate and evident shift towards let the treasuries go off the balance sheet, let them mature and go away. Let's reduce our purchases and start buying gold instead. So that tells you that all the other nations in the world know what's going on and they're looking for solutions. This is why you have the big push for CBDCs globally. They're looking for a way to trade with each other efficiently and quickly by digitizing their own currencies. The Chinese yuan is becoming the template. The ECNY, the Chinese CBDC, is becoming the template by which the other countries are developing their own CBDCs so that they can do trade with each other, but then settle that trade in gold. So again, it's that if they're not buying our treasuries and the dollar is losing purchasing power, that currency is weakening. At a weaker currency, loss of purchasing power, asset prices go up, that cycle repeats, you get inflation. And it's almost like everywhere you look, there's these forces that are driving inflation and they're going to keep it more persistent, which tells me that this article is no longer a question. It's we're just starting into it and that we should prepare for it.
Yeah, I can see that. In terms of the trade with the gold settled, I guess what that means is they're agreeing on the spot rate. Like, I trust you enough for your valuation of your currency today and how much I think exists, but I don't trust you going forward. I guess that's how they get through the trade. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Luke Groman summed up this white paper from the Fed as he said it's a critical white paper. He said assuming a 730 billion US deficit, which is currently closer to 1.7 trillion. Inflation needed to finance U.S. deficits and fiscal dominance varies from 8% if we crush U.S. bank profits with repression to 16% if we don't crush the U.S. banks to 41% if Fed keeps paying interest on all reserves. So those are your three buckets of 8, 16, or 41. Like no one there am I hearing like 2, 4, or 6, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is really,
Staggering.
And yeah, and then you think you'd have to double or triple any of those numbers because like the whole time we heard we were at 2%, we were probably at 6 or 12%. Now we're hearing we're at 3%, we're probably at 9, 12, or 15%. I'm making these numbers up, but I mean, I don't believe the numbers, but I think they're a guidepost.
Yeah. And think about just an 8% inflation rate, right? I mean, the United States was melting down when we were clipping away at reported CPI of 9%. Imagine that being persistent across a decade. What that would mean for your food prices, what that would mean for borrowing money, right? What that would mean for the value of your income relative to what you need to buy, food, healthcare, gas, etc. Just your daily needs. It's a massive impact. We're talking about the price of everything doubling like every few years. Or the other end of that spectrum, a 40% inflation rate where everything doubles in 2 years. Or another way to think about that, your purchasing power is cut in half. So it's a massive impact, and it's all hidden behind, this Fed speak, Treasury speak that is so obscure and hiding the truth from everybody. I mean, when I start to think about it, it makes me furious. But this is why sometimes you'll see me chuckle because really deep down inside, I'm so angry for what it means for my fellow citizens that don't understand it. It's heartbreaking what is and could happen in short order. Let alone what that means for guys like you and I with kids and raising families and just trying to protect them from the chaos, right? So I don't want to be a doomer and gloomer, but I certainly want everybody to get the message and prepare.
Yeah, I hear you there. And you know, the numbers kind of line up a little bit in the back of the envelope, back of the napkin math. So it's like they printed 30% of the money supply during COVID. We hit 9% CPI. But I think it was really like 30% on hard assets because that's
Oh
where
yeah,
most of the printing got fed, and it didn't all go into consumer goods. But
right.
also maybe consumer goods went up like the 9% is the 30%, and maybe hard assets went up by 60%. I don't know, but
Well, I mean, think
uh,
about that, right? You're absolutely right. Like inflation. Think about how fast the prices of homes went up.
mhm.
Think about how
More than
fast
9%,
the
I'll tell you
price of
that.
food went up.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I don't
And
believe these numbers of 9% are not indicative of
right.
what we're experiencing.
What didn't go up was that you didn't have to go to work. You got on a Zoom call,
Right.
right? And you weren't traveling and taking
Right.
vacations. You were, watching Netflix. So
Right.
again, it's illustrating how technology is deflationary, where this monetary inflation that came in during COVID, it flew into these assets and these services that are going to start to become deflationary assets because of AI. Right. And it's like every time I hear deflation is coming, I think more money printing is required to lift the price of those assets back up so that we have a high GDP, so that they can pay the debt. So as soon as I think, oh, okay, we're going to have a recession, we're going to have an economic financial collapse, and we're going to get all asset prices are going to drop. I hear people talk about this kind of stuff all the time, right? Oh, it's going to be just like 2008. We're going to have another great financial crisis. The banks are going to go under, blah, 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 blah. All the same stuff that you hear because they're looking in the rearview mirror saying, this is what's going to happen again without understanding that we've slipped into fiscal dominance and that now any financial crisis is so deflationary that they have no option but to print if they want to survive. If you want to maintain power and control, you're going to have to print. And that means the everyday person is going to suffer. If they don't print, right? The first chart in that slide deck, right? Go to the dollar purchasing power since 1913, which everyone's seen, right? When did the dollar go up in purchasing power from the 1920s to the mid to late 1930s, right? This is like the Great Depression, the largest deflationary collapse in US history was driving the dollar up in purchasing power as assets fell, right? And 100 years of hindsight, you could look back and question, were they purposely not feeding liquidity into the system? We had a central bank. Was there a reason not to bail out the United States at that point in time? Or is it just a coincidence they made a mistake, right? That's what we're taught, that they made a mistake. We learned from our mistakes, right? Bernanke said this in 2008. Oh, we learned from the mistakes of the Great Depression. We're not going to let another depression happen. So we're going to do QE. Then we're going to do QE forever, right? So, but you go back to the 20s and you go back to the Great Depression, you can see deflation, dollar value rise. You can see it in the chart. Other than that decade, it's just a long, slow decline in the purchasing power of the right. If you take that blip out, it's just a persistent down and to the right, loss of value, inflation permanently. During that era, We didn't, that was deflation, dollar up in the United States. And so here we are again. Are we in a situation where we're going to get a massive deflationary pulse? Either they're going to print, or what happens if they don't? What if all of a sudden they come to Jesus and it's fiscal prudence all of a sudden? What does that mean? Right? So that's a totally different spec. I can't imagine the collusion and the corruption that it would take place for something like that to happen. I think the default's going to be print, but either outcome is pretty catastrophic.
What are you saying about the Great Depression? That they either made a mistake or are you saying like
Well,
they got it right and they won't?
I remember being taught in school. I remember hearing Bernanke during
Yeah,
2008, and I talk about how we learned our lessons from the Great Depression.
right.
We learned our lessons about that we need to add monetary units, that we can't be fiscally prudent
So why do you think they let it
during
go
a
up?
deflationary pulse. What's that?
Why do you think that was the only like period where like the buying power of the
Well, I'm
dollar
talking
went
about
up?
a major move, right? And you can see it if you look at the chart in that purchasing power of the dollar. What ends up happening if you get deflation, it's that scale again. Asset prices drop, dollar purchasing power up. Add monetary units into the system, dollar value, dollar purchasing power down, asset prices get more expensive. Right? Since the Great Depression, it's been add monetary units, keep asset prices going up, 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 up. Of course, you're going to get volatility that you don't see in the long trend of history. But it is great to zoom out and just look at that from since 1913 and see this big dollar pulse relative to assets going way down in value. And then to think about that in terms of where we are today, of what would that look like if we had a massive deflationary pulse and they didn't print? The debt would become absolutely unsustainable. There would be no GDP would drop so aggressively that tax revenue would drop so aggressively, right? And you can see this when we had like the great financial crisis, when we had any recession going back. You can watch the tax revenue drop, right? Now, if once you cross that fiscal dominance line, if that tax revenue drops that steeply, it just you have to accelerate money printing, which is why. So when I'm saying, we get every time I start to think about what does it mean to have a recession now? It means if the government wants to stay in power, if the government wants to keep financing their operations, the government wants to keep financing wars, the government wants to keep paying for Social Security, that means print more and more money. Print non-interest bearing debts. And if that means that the loss of purchasing power of the dollar is going to accelerate. And if that's accelerating, that currency is going to die. People are going to look for an alternative. The sovereign states are looking for an alternative. They're buying gold. Bitcoiners have found an alternative. They're buying Bitcoin. I think you end up in a position where those that figure it out fast enough benefit the most, and those that are left behind suffer the most as Bitcoin becomes the last currency standing.
Yeah, and so I want to kind of you noted how, I mean, countries are moving away from the reserve currency of the dollar, and it's interesting. You noted some of these projects that China is doing alongside these other countries to settle digitally and in non-dollars. And I mean, they look like to me like almost like shitcoin projects. They're so small and they have funky names, but they're taking these things seriously.
Absolutely.
And you note how BRICS to launch politics-free blockchain-based payment system. I like they want it to be politics-free. I guess these leaders got together on March 5th of 2024 to announce this independent payment system based on cryptocurrency and blockchain. They took a picture together.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a big deal. I don't think that got a lot of press
Yeah.
in our country.
Right.
But let's talk a little bit about AI and hyper deflation.
Sure.
I mean, how many jobs are we talking about? Like, are at risk from AI
Yeah.
in your sort of estimation?
I mean, they're anticipating. So, these numbers are all remain to be seen, but the anticipation in the United States is that it's going to be about 73 million jobs that are lost by 2030. China is
By
anticipating,
2030.
yeah,
That's a
right,
lot. I mean, that's got to be half the working population.
right.
I mean, that's not 1/4 of the
No,
population or one
it's
fifth. I mean,
massive. Yeah, it's massive. Um,
and that's not a long time from now,
it's
like
not.
an election and a half.
And it's going to, it's far, you can roll out AI faster than you can come up with new jobs to replace it. This is where, I hear a lot of people talk about, oh, well, AI is going to be a massive productivity boom. I see that productivity boom being offset by a loss in real income by the American people, right? Income tax is far better than capital gains tax. I know that the vast majority of our revenue in the US government is capital gains tax, but you know,
Hmm.
if you end up having 73 million people lose their jobs, and we are actually looking at most of those jobs being white collar jobs, higher paid jobs, people that are in the, say, 25 to 30% tax bracket. That's a pretty significant shot, or deduction in tax revenue for the United States. Jobs or corporations, as you know, are highly incentivized from the current tax treatment to switch to artificial intelligence to replace humans with robots. There's a great tax treatment for them as well. So if they're depreciating assets versus paying income, that has a significant shift in the tax revenue of the United States. And then who are the companies that are rolling out AI? They're the biggest of the big tech. And how much do they pay in tax already? Right? If anybody can shelter income, it's them. So I see AI as being massively deflationary when I look at it from the perspective of what's going to be the revenue for the US government. And therefore, I see it making it even more difficult to finance US deficits. So I see this as a really big deflationary pulse.
It makes me wonder. I mean, I'm under the assumption that sort of like the military like rolls out tech like AI to the private sector after it's sort of developed it.
Sure.
And so I wonder how much they're throttling AI now to kind of just stem, these
Hmm.
losses, like rolling out like not so great versions,
Right.
limiting what they could be done with them, almost like dampening our expectations about AI, either so that we're lulled to sleep as the chain comes,
Sure.
or that we don't, so small business owners don't take it on. I don't know what it is. Like I feel like we're getting the crappiest version of what's actually probably in existence.
Yeah, right.
And then
Yeah,
maybe they're
you're
throttling
you're
it that way.
you're probably right. I mean, if you think about war game technology, it's probably the most sophisticated artificial intelligence you can imagine. They've been using that for decades, right? I'm sure it's far better than ChatGPT 4.
Right, right.
And and yeah, also, I mean, I'm sorry, but I always get thrown into these conspiratorial rabbit holes, and I have no problem going down them. So forgive me if you don't like this kind of stuff. But it would make sense if you pumped everybody up about the future of AI, you drove asset prices up. Oh, it doesn't really work as good as we thought, and everybody sells off and takes capital gains, and then the next cycle we get the next version, right? I mean, to pump it in and out in these kind of
Mm,
cycles would make a lot of sense. Is it that coordinated? I
I
have
don't
no
know,
clue.
but it's
Who
interesting that
knows, right? But
I didn't know that the largest share of tax receipts come from capital gains.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's really interesting because right now it seems like one of the policy changes that the regime's looking at, and I don't know if it's the uniparty, but it's like raising
right,
capital gains tax. And
right.
it's
I
interesting.
mean,
It's
if you
like
have
talk about going for the jugular. It's like you already get the most receipts from that area, but if you're losing jobs, I mean, that's where you have to get more blood from.
right, and align that knowledge with the knowledge of the demographic bubble in the United States. All the
Right,
wealth
right,
sitting in the boomer population.
right.
They
With
own all the assets,
all the houses.
all the houses, all the
Right,
stocks, all the
right,
everything.
right.
You end up sitting there saying, okay, we run an inflationary cycle and we create what's called a crack up boom, which if translates to dollar losing purchasing power, assets go up. That's what a crack up boom is, meaning the economy's falling apart, but assets are skyrocketing. It's COVID, just the bigger, more persistent version. And in a crack up boom type scenario, yeah, you got boomers that are like, hey, this might be the last trip I take. This might be the last house I buy. This might be the last time I get to buy that Lamborghini. This might be the last Rolls Royce, the last dinner, the last cruise. They're gonna sell those assets, pay the taxes, and enjoy those last moments. Um, sure, there's so many things pointing to why inflation makes sense
And they're going to
for
sell those
the
assets to
government.
investors and not their kids at a reasonable price,
Right.
so that the investors then gather up all those assets.
Yeah.
The state taxes the other half, and then the kids end up with nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that
Oh,
they can
and
enjoy their,
my
martinis on the cruise, I guess.
my portfolio doubled this year, so little Johnny will get plenty. We can spend some money, right?
Right.
Without thinking about the long-term impacts of the cost of living. So again, I tend to be a little more conspiratorial than the average person, but when you start connecting the dots, you start looking at all this stuff, you're like, huh, boy, that's nice for them.
Well, there's another aspect of this that, I mean, I hadn't thought about maybe from this angle, but where does fraud play into, AI and the debt-based monetary system?
Yeah, that's that's really interesting. I mean, it like AI fraud and combating fraud with AI is becoming quite the arms race. Um, in the presentation, I talk about that this was like the first quarter of 2023, that 34% of the fraud in the United States was a liveliness bypass. Anybody in the Bitcoin or community knows, like, right, you open up that wallet, or you center your face and they have you look in both directions, up and down. They have you hold your driver's license and they're trying to verify with artificial intelligence with that you are the person in that image, and that if they instruct you to do something, you can follow that instruction, right? So they're trying to verify that you are not an image, but you're an alive person. And this biometric data is now being bypassed with AI fraud, right? So if you haven't heard some of the statistics that exist, um, or if you haven't seen it in social media, they can now take a still picture, right? I can rip a picture of Cedric off Twitter, or a short clip of him from a podcast, and create an artificial image slash video of you that looks enough like you and can move on demand to bypass a liveliness check for KYC. that's, I think, long story short, I think that ends up breaking the credit-based payment system. I'll stop there and let you go, but
Well, what does that mean? Like,
yeah,
why does it break the credit-based payment system? What are some of the implications of using a credit-based payment with this sort of
right.
like AI fraud capabilities?
Sure. So like when you use a credit card or you send ACH payment from your bank account, that those payments don't settle for days, weeks, or months later. You've all experienced credit card fraud, and you can call your credit card company and have that transaction reversed, right? So if I can imitate you, I can imitate your data, which I'm not a dark web aficionado, but I have been told and I have heard that you can buy identities online very, very cheaply, right? So I could get a copy of your driver's license, I could get a copy of your phone number, email, social security card number. With all the big hacks that have happened in our lifetime, all that data exists out there. So if we said we wanted to target Cedric and we could grab his data and now we could create a 3D animated video, we could copy his voice, we have his driver's license, we have his credit card information, we have social security, etc. We can conduct fraudulent payments, we can open up fraudulent accounts, we could do transactions, and we can reverse those transactions before they settle. Right now, for you and I, that's a risk for us, right? Meaning, are we the one random person that for whatever reason this fraudster targeted? And now we have to deal with the problem of having our identity stolen. That's a problem for us, but for a big retailer, say like Amazon or a big bank, that's just a cost of doing business for them. Oh, we have 1%, 2% a year in fraud. We make it up in fees, and that's just a cost of doing business. We got insurance for anything that's major. If AI shifts that to a DDoS level identity fraud, meaning they're spinning up fraudulent identities and doing fraudulent transactions at like a DDoS pace because of the technical capabilities of AI, that shifts the risk from a problem for you and I to a problem where Amazon says we cannot afford to do business. I cannot afford to accept a credit-based payment, a dollar-based payment. I need instant settlement. If I receive a payment at Amazon and I pack and ship that box in an hour or less, and that thing's not coming back to the warehouse, and that payment gets reversed 2 hours later or 2 days later, if that happens at a pace where it's not 1 or 2% of the business, but say 30, 40, 50% of sales, then they cannot afford to work in the credit-based payment system anymore. That's massively deflationary. And it's going to shift retailers towards, I cannot afford to accept the dollar. I cannot afford to accept a debt-based payment. And because the debt-based payment is why these things need, like, because we have debt behind every dollar, that's why we need to have KYC AML. If your money's your money and there's no other person between you and your money, and you can have instant settlement, if your money is no one's liability, which is what we're talking about with Bitcoin, and you can have instant settlement, the risk associated with credit-based payment systems go away. So I can see AI having such a massive impact on KYC, AML, BSA, KYB, that it destroys the credit-based payment system. It destroys your ability to trust it and destroys the ability for a retailer to accept it. So, I'm currently working at a company that is doing Bitcoin POS systems. And we think about this like mycelium through the forest. Like, can we just spread this into as many retailers as possible? They don't need to do a lot of transactions. We're not looking at it from the perspective of this is going to make us a lot of money. We currently make money in other means in the Bitcoin economy. But if we can penetrate the payments systems so that everybody has the ability to accept a payment here and there with Bitcoin, it's going to be like the mycelium spreading to the forest floor that just pops up everywhere when this reality comes to fruition. And I don't think very many people have really considered that. Unless you're inside the system and you're dealing day to day with the problems of payment settlement, it's hard to even fathom this future.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about it now as like it's almost like this asset versus currency wars that we're going through now with Bitcoin, in this latest round of evolution. Your chart though, on implications of AI fraud and deflation, you know how risk shifts from the individual to corporate and state level attacks. Deflation accelerates as payment systems fail. Corporations, banks, government can no longer rely on trust-based systems or KYC AML. Bitcoin-based payment infrastructure required for improved security, immediate settlement, eliminating chargebacks. Widespread adoption of Bitcoin and Bitcoin key cryptography is the solution to AI threats. So, I mean, that kind of brings us, with Bitcoin key cryptography as a solution to AI threats. It makes me think of what, maybe Saylor's latest project with DID and identification on Bitcoin. This whole conversation around instant settlement and payments makes me think about, how people are, what seems like positioning Bitcoin as either property or an asset, or more of a currency. And, I would argue that the overlying sort of way I'm looking at that, though, is that Bitcoin is competing to be money, and money is all three of those things at once. It might be performing better in one at the other or become one before the other, but money is all three at once. But I do think,
Good money is, yeah. Hard
yeah.
money is, yeah.
And I think the United States government, doesn't care about store of value.
Right.
I think they care about MOE, medium exchange, and unit of account. I think that's where this battle is emanating from, is they want Bitcoin to be an asset. They want it to go up in dollar terms. And maybe that's why, the ETF is here and have people use it as a way to just transact and sling assets around.
No, I think you're 100% correct, right? Is that as store of value, Bitcoin can essentially be looked at like a free market-based trillion-dollar coin that fixes the balance sheet by increasing the asset base of the population of the United States, or the global asset base for that matter, right? As this massive liquidity sponge with a fixed supply, the only thing that can happen is price expands, right? Units don't expand, just price. So if you get exponential price growth for every dollar that goes into the system, you can rapidly expand the market cap of this new asset. And that would do what? It would expand the tax base, right? It would give people that adopted it the ability to convert that into a currency that they could buy all the things they want with. And at the same time, through Lightning and Fediments and potentially Cashew, eCash derivatives, there's a future that's emerging where Bitcoin is a medium of exchange on second, third layers. And that medium of exchange is a bearer instrument. It's nobody else's liability. And that's the true solution to this credit-based payment system. And all I'm suggesting is they may not be able to keep as much as they would like to just have Bitcoin be a store value that fixes the balance sheet. They may not be able to sustain that. They might need to, at some point, come to the grips that the fraud generated by AI is so massive that Bitcoin key, your private public key pair and Bitcoin being a bearer instrument is the only payment that's going to function. If we get to that position, all fiat dies. All KYC, AML based credit payment systems die. And when I figured that out, that was like this aha moment that I felt like, oh, how many people are really considering this? This might be almost inevitable. Because I feel like, right, fraudsters are the first ones to always adopt new technology. They're the first ones to master it. They're the first ones to scale it. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's, race cars to run alcohol, or whether it's Bitcoin on the Silk Road for the first time, whether it's, pornography and drugs on the internet, you name it, right? Technology is always more rapidly adopted in the criminal networks than anywhere else. They have the most incentive to use it. And so they're going to be the first big adopters of AI. They're going to push it and leverage it far faster than I think the average citizen is going to, the average business is going to, the average retailer is going to use it to defend themselves. And so I could see this becoming a major issue in the not too distant future. And if that's the case, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of retailers suddenly shift towards, I'm no longer taking credit cards. I'm no longer taking checks. I will take dollars. I will take gold. I'll take Bitcoin. I want a bearer instrument. I want something that you hand me across the table that you cannot take back.
Right. Hence gold settled. I wonder too, are they throttling chip production? I mean, is there artificial scarcity to hold AI back? How much are they going to try to hold machinery back and, make it illegal to kind of operate certain things? I could also see that impacting mining. There's a confluence there with chips and mining, and, ASICs are just application specific integrated chips. It's not a Bitcoin thing, an ASIC. It also, when you talk about sort of Bitcoin, growing the asset base, on the other side of that coin, and, with my conversation with Mark Goodwin is, it was like the Tether, CBDCs, USDC, I mean, all the treasuries that support that. And so,
Yeah.
and it makes me think that there's going to be some sort of requirement, or I think he was kind of put this in my head, is like, for all the Bitcoin you hold, you have to hold an equal amount of non-interest bearing dollars. Right. So,
That's interesting.
yeah, I think that's where they kind of get you to have your reserve requirements. Well, if you're going to hold the Bitcoin ETF as JP Morgan, you have to hold these non-interest bearing treasury notes in equal amount. And
Yeah.
I think part of this battle is what you're getting at. I mean, if they could throttle AI, is like, I think this intersection of number go up versus self-custody. And I think number go ups is sort of built into Bitcoin. But what I mean by that is they don't want you to have self-custody, and then they'll kind of be more in favor of number go up. And they'll give you number go up in exchange for, the Bitcoin ETF, or non-custodial wallets, non-money
Yeah.
servicing businesses, like a way to give less liquidity to Bitcoin circular economies and to self-custody. And I think that, because if it's in self-custody, they can't ask you to hold the treasury that has non-interest bearing interest on it. And the more people that hold it, the more it's potential for a medium of exchange and unit of account. I mean, you can use that as unit of account even if you don't have any Bitcoin. You could count Bitcoin,
Yeah.
and I think people should, and that's a whole show. But I just think they're trying to throttle that any way they can. So
No, I mean,
fascinating.
that's been more and more evident in just this last week.
Yeah, I mean, with Samurai and
Mhm.
Phoenix and Wasabi's decision to leave the U.S. and
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think it would be scary to operate in the States. in those vectors, if you want your freedom and you don't want to end up in a cell,
Right.
because
That's
they could
right.
put you in a cell and even figure out that they're wrong 10 years
Yeah,
later, and that's no
absolutely.
fun.
Yeah, it's not a it's a very narrow path you have to walk in the industry between providing what you believe is a viable self-custody solution that's non-custodial and giving people the education they need to be self-sufficient Bitcoiners and not end up in jail. It's that simple. And we get pushback all the time from people who say, we have to, like, can we do a purchase of a certain amount? If we do a certain amount, do we not have to KYC? No, because we don't want to end up in jail. That's just, unfortunately, this is the world we live in. And as much as we don't like KYC AML, none of us want to end up in jail. So if you're going to do business with us, you will go through that process.
Right.
And so it is a significant throttle. It's a reality that exists. And I'm just wondering and speculating, does AI break that?
Right.
If does the thing that they probably love the most, because nobody's talking about AI energy consumption, right? I think they like AI because they can program it. They can get it to regurgitate to you what they want it to tell you.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
that fits their line of thinking as a control structure.
Right.
But if this technology is out, if people start to build their own AIs for the benefit of committing massive fraud, and that really goes as an attack against the credit-based payment system, which is where the honeypots are at. It's not Bitcoin doing it. We become the solution to protect your bank. The enemy of the bank is now the friend of the bank because it protects the bank. The banks now look at Bitcoin cryptography as, oh, it's not the enemy, it's the solution. We better learn private key cryptography in order to secure our entire system. We need to stop relying on identities that we can no longer trust. We need to rely on, do you have Bitcoin and can you send it to a wallet? And if you have a bearer instrument that you can send to a wallet, we will do business with you, period. And so the friend, your enemy's enemy is your friend. I could see Bitcoin being that in the future. Jason Lowry talks about this a lot, in terms that a lot of people get angry about. But if you boil it down to what it is, in a world where you cannot trust anybody, this is the only trusted source. This is the only trusted ledger. It's the only trusted currency. It's the only trusted technology. In that world, all the people that hate it are forced to adopt it. So this is why I come to this kind of conclusion at the end of this, is that it's the last currency standing. It wins by default because it's the only system you can trust. It's the only system that hasn't gone to zero. And this is where the whole meme, you get the price you deserve, comes from. It's like, I mean, Bitcoiners have been pounding the table for how many years now? Trouble's coming. There's danger on the horizon. And we're just trying all these different ways to educate people. And now people seem to be waking up from so many different angles. Maybe you're waking up from realizing that your food supply looks like poison once you learn a lot about it.
Hmm.
Maybe you're waking up because your healthcare provider didn't quite treat you as a fiduciary when COVID broke out. Maybe you're waking up because your dollar is not purchasing as much as it used to. Maybe you're waking up because a hang glider took down the Mossad intelligence agency and the Iron Dome. On and on and on. Whatever wakes you up. and focuses you in on, I need to find the truth, those paths towards looking for truth lead you to Bitcoin. And if Bitcoin becomes the only true source that you can trust, I think that's how it wins. So just staying the course, being the trusted ledger, and letting the world kind of come to this understanding around it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The name of this paper is just Fiscal Dominance and the Return of Zero Interest Bank Reserve Requirements. I mean, this is not even a question.
Yeah.
Like this is happening.
Yeah.
That's endgame. What is your rabbit hole story?
I'm sorry, my
What
rabbit hole
is,
story?
yeah, how
Oh,
did you find Bitcoin?
um, well, that's funny. I just talked about this the other day with a friend of mine. I was actually living in Montana in 2009 when Bitcoin came out, and we were talking about it. And I did the exact same thing everybody else does. I was, oh yeah, that's awesome, but that's never gonna work. They're gonna shut that down. Uh, and then, we ended up moving to Florida. 2016 rolls around, and I start hearing about Bitcoin again. I'm in finance, and I start looking into it, and I said, I'm gonna get a little, just see what this is all about, try and figure it out, learn. I think, I bought like $1,500, and then all of a sudden, it like within 2 weeks, it doubled the price. I was like, well, why didn't I buy more? Like, I, you start questioning yourself. Like, you thought it was a great thing. It sounded like a great idea. Why didn't you buy more? And then during that cycle, right, it goes all the way to 20,000, and I'm buying it all the way up. And you feel like something nobody else knows. You're immediately yeah, you're immediately start to thinking like a shitcoiner. You immediately start thinking everything's going to be tokenized. All real world assets are going to be on a blockchain, blah, blah, blah. The same stuff every newbie goes through. And you start buying all the shitcoins. So 2017, 2018, I've got this long list of shitcoins, and I'm sending Bitcoin all over the globe to every fucking random exchange to buy shitcoins. And then I found Tone Vase, who spanked me hard and took me back to reality, right? Because this FOMO makes you think like a moron. And to Tone Vase credit, always kept people focused on the truth. And I shut off all the other media, and it was just tone, tone, tone every day, every guest, it just all the way through the bear market. And that's where I really learned about Bitcoin, right? 2018, 19, I sold all the shit coins, consolidated everything back to Bitcoin in far less Bitcoin than I had bought in Bitcoin value, because I lost so much in these shit coins. And then just started stacking, dollar cost averaging Bitcoin all the way through the bear market, all the way up, and have never stopped. So it's just, I always, and I use this as kind of advice and guidance for people. I said the key to Bitcoin is start, get some, figure out what is the dollar amount every week that you can afford to put away and never see again. If that's $50, $100, if that, whatever it is, set it up, DCA, buy your Bitcoin every day, and study and learn and study and learn, because 100 hours is not enough. I mean, I'm still learning, right? I've been in since 2000, late or early 2017 or late 2016, something like that, and I'm still learning. And I listen to at least 2 podcasts a day, at least minimum. There's days where I just consume massive amounts of Bitcoin content, and there's always something there I hadn't heard before, and something that I'm learning from. It like just the best financial education anyone could buy, and it's whatever, and your ticket to entry is whatever you can afford on a weekly basis to stack, and it'll change your life. Um, and I really mean it'll change your life. Like it, and that, like, no joke, not just in a material way, because I believe that once you understand Bitcoin, once you understand the way it's structured, and you start to realize that no matter how many coins you have, whether even if it's a fraction of a coin, that is going to lead to dollar value that you may not have ever thought you could ever achieve. So from wherever you start, once you grok Bitcoin, you realize where you're going. And when you realize where you're going, you start to feel wealthy. You start to feel abundant. It's just a matter of time. The abundance is coming. The wealth is coming. It's just a matter of time. That is such a massive shift in your mindset that you begin to attract other positive things into your life. I was telling this to somebody the other day, like remember when you were dating, right? You're in college and you're dating. Well, whenever you had a girlfriend, all the other girls wanted to date, right? It's that mind shift, right? It's the vibe you give off. Like, I'm good. I'm the man. I have got a great relation. I've got my girl. And now every other girl wants to be a part of that. Once you make that shift and you understand that Bitcoin is going to create wealth for you, it's going to create abundance for you, you start to attract wealth and abundance from all angles. It's a complete shift in your energy and what you attract. It also, right, it also gives you like this mindset of like, you want me to do what? I don't need to do that. I don't I don't I don't have to do that for a paycheck. I think maybe I'll do something else, because as long as I'm stacking Bitcoin, I'm going to be good. I'm getting to where I need to go. It's a massive shift, and I can't recommend it highly enough for everybody, right? If you feel like you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you feel like you're never going to get ahead, this is the way. This is how to break that cycle, right? This is whether it's $10 a week, $25 a week, 100, whatever it is. This will break your cycle, and you will be on a completely different trajectory. And that is, I want everybody to feel that. Like, it really upgrades humanity in a massive way. And some people have talked about that and figured it out. I just like, it's for real.
Wow. Well, Paul, it's been amazing conversation. It's been really dope. I hope one time I'd love to learn fly fishing.
Yeah.
It just seems really like a frustrating activity, but I've always wanted to go. Uh,
It's
you
like
know,
Bitcoin. It's 100,000 hours to get to where you want to be.
yeah, that's what I've heard. We met for lunch earlier this week because you mentioned it's just a matter of time. And during our conversation, you brought up something really interesting that just like alligators and sharks kind of live on a different time frame. They don't really kind of I don't know, what is it like?
But yeah, their blood is like super super resilient, right? So like in Moat Marine here, they're doing tests with shark blood because cancer cells will not live in it, right? Alligators have no lifespan, right? So as long as they've got food, they will continue to grow and live forever. And it's like once they outgrow their habitat and they can't get enough resources to survive, then they start to get disease and then they die. There's some, I've always been fascinated with wildlife, and um, you know, the species on this planet are amazing. There's some really great stuff. So fly fishing for me is a way to get out there and experience all of that, and combine the science of nature with the art of fly fishing. So yeah, I love it. It's been a passion of mine for a long time. I was a guide and a instructor for many, many years. Tie flies professionally. You know, I'm a Bitcoin addict and I'm a fly fishing addict.
Yeah, well, that's cool.
So if there's any Bitcoiners out there that fly fish, please look me up.
Yeah, maybe let me tag along.
Yeah,
And
cool.
so I had two questions that kind of came out of not, these are rhetorical questions, but it's like, yeah, and you kind of brought them up. These were your questions, I think. What if humans could live forever, or like 500
Yeah.
years? And
Right.
like, what is that? Like, it wasn't so much like what was cool about the question. It wasn't like, oh, well, that's just great. We could live longer. It was like, what does that do to our time preference? Like, can you take on a 10-year project
Yeah.
knowing it may or may not, achieve the results you're hoping for, but can you take those kind of chances? And what would it be like to see several of your generations after you grow up? I mean, kind
Right.
of think about like, we always say like standing on the shoulders of giants for lots of different things, but imagine you were able to like sit down with like your great 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 grandfather and ask them questions,
Right.
and learn from them
Yes.
and
Yeah.
have them kind of see, maybe they didn't know it all when they were your age, obviously, but having that many generations to watch grow up, like they
Yeah.
might,
It's such a
they might have
great,
been idiots back then, but maybe they're geniuses now, of wealth of
well, and it's
knowledge.
a great thing to contemplate because think about, I'm sure you're familiar with the fourth turning, right?
Hmm.
Neil Howe's book. The whole reason why the fourth turning exists is because the cycles repeat because generations forget.
Right.
Because
And
there is no great grandfather,
right.
imparting the knowledge of, this is what happened 100,
And maybe
200.
even the real knowledge, like,
Right. The
like the
real
stories are
firsthand
getting
experience.
destroyed. Yeah.
Right. Not the winners rewriting history.
Yeah. Right.
It's no, don't believe that. This is what I lived through. This is what they
Yep.
did. That creates a trajectory of learning where history doesn't repeat, where we learn
Right.
from history. That's a totally different trajectory. And so the fact that we have this roughly 80 to 100-year time frame or time span in our life creates the cyclical nature that we see in the fourth turning. Now, you start to think about Bitcoin as money that could last thousands and thousands and thousands of years, presuming we don't create something better. And then combine that with technology that is life extension, where we are now, maybe we're not as concerned about estate planning, which is the world I worked in for many, many years, right? Maybe we're not so much concerned about managing money for the future generation. Maybe we're now concerned with building citadels, building farms, building communities that support the education and upbringing of multiple generations. And like you said, like if you look historically when we've had hard money, the golden age, right? When we were on as good of a hard money as we've had, this is when a lot of human innovation took place. This is when serious advancements took place because you could endow somebody with a certain amount of money and they could then afford to tinker. They could afford to experiment over long periods of time to innovate, to create things that drastically benefited humanity, right? So we have that again with Bitcoin. If we can get on a Bitcoin standard, if Bitcoin starts to accelerate to the point where we get significant adoption, you're now going to have people empowered to think long enough, long term, to be like, I really want to fix this problem. I don't need to worry about feeding my family. We're okay. We're going to be fine financially. I can now devote all my time to fixing this problem for humanity. Right. And
Hmm.
that's what gives me so much hope for Bitcoin. You start like, look at Michael Saylor, right? I want to make a million, a billion, whatever he said, PhDs, a billion PhDs for free. I want to give them that education. That changes humanity. So now apply that to all the Bitcoiners that over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years become incredibly wealthy. And these are people that when you talk to them, they're not like, they're not crypto people. They're not worried about buying a Lambo, at least the ones I've talked to, right? Sure, they're going to reward themselves a bit, but they're generally more concerned. If you're an early adopter of Bitcoin, you're probably more concerned with, and you got into this because you saw it as hope. You saw it as a way to change so many bad things that you saw happening in the world. And so given the resources to do that, you're going to try and fix it. That combined with life extension, combined with number go up, could build, restructure, reorganize society in an incredibly positive way. It doesn't happen at the flick of a switch. Like we've discussed, there's going to be huge battles to get there. But if you have that vision of hope and you have that longer term time horizon, you will fight that fight. It's worth fighting for, right? So that makes me hopeful. That's why we get into Bitcoin. We see it as a way to flip the tables on the corruption of the world.
Yeah, man. Bitcoin is hope. I can't wait to see you in Miami, May 11th. That's going to be incredible. I'm going to leave it to you to let people know where they can find you and your work.
Oh, I appreciate it. The easiest way to find me is on Twitter, Paul S. Tarantino on Twitter. You can find me at Byte Federal, bytefederal.com, and you can find me at freshstartplans.com, which is a financial advisory firm. So those are the three main ways to reach me now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Cedric. Have a good night, buddy.
Yeah, man. And that's what's up this week with Paul Tarantino on the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. Get up to $100 when you sign up and buy Bitcoin at partner.river.com/matrix. Get your sats off your exchange and secure them with the new standard in Bitcoin multi-sig security. And get 6 months free when you download the app at thea.us/Cedric. You can support the Bitcoin Matrix podcast with a boost on the Fountain app and by writing a 5-star review wherever you dome your pods. That would really help me get the word out and help new listeners to find the show. And of course, thank you for listening. Keep building, keep stacking, and always be laser focused out there. This is Cedric. Peace.